Welcome to another day, another stream. This time, something a little different. We are joined by the one and only Jason Schreier, the author of the upcoming book, Press Reset, Ruin and Recovery in the Video Game Industry. Good morning, Jason. How are you this morning?
Hello. Good morning, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Jason and I, very old friends. We hung out at the GMG offices all the time. But no, but Jason and I, both former GMG employees, and
Yes. Can we still call it that? I feel like we have to call
dude,
it
I
Geo
know
Media
Go
now.
Media. I refuse to. I think that a part of me is like I will never let GMG die, but yeah, technically Go Media now. Thank you so much for joining me, Jason. I know you've got a busy day, so we'll get right into the questions, but we will start off with a fun one. I just wanted to get your a lot of cool video games have come out this year already. I just wanted to know, what is your front runner right now for game of the year, or your favorite game this year?
I don't know. I haven't really given it any thought as to what my favorite was. Like I've enjoyed a bunch of games, but I can give a shout out. I'll give a shout out to a small game I just played recently called um, what is it called? Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion.
Mm.
It's called, and it's this adorable little Zelda-like indie game that you can beat in like 3 hours. It's very kid-friendly, very funny, and I just had a blast playing through a couple weeks ago. So that's so far one of my highlights of the year, even though I don't have like a specific game of the year picked out just yet.
What system is it on?
PC and
Oh,
Switch.
okay. Okay, cool. I'm gonna have to. I think I have seen you tweet about that, and it's piqued my interest. Same thing with
It's got a great name, so yeah.
yeah. Well, I remember when you tweeted out Barbara is you, and
Hmm.
that was like, oh, I'll have to check this out, and that was like, oh my god, this is one of my favorite games. And on the podcast I'm a part of, like, we all were playing Barbara is you because of that tweet.
Yeah,
Um,
I really like discovering like little indie gems, and
mhm.
although Baba's you got a lot of attention, but I really like discovering those types of games and finding them, and I try to play a lot of stuff and talk about it if I really like it.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to check that out. So, Jason, you obviously former uh, Kotaku staff writer for a
Hmm.
very long time, and then obviously recently jumped over to Bloomberg. How long has it been at Bloomberg now?
I've now been at Bloomberg for about a year,
Okay.
and yeah, I left Kotaku in April of last year and joined Bloomberg in May. So yeah, it's been about a year.
Has it been everything you wanted it to be? How you been feeling about it?
Yeah, it's been fascinating. It's like it's such an interesting challenge. It's such a different sort of experience writing for a Bloomberg audience, a finance audience, a mainstream audience, as opposed to the gaming audience that we had at Kotaku. And so there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of things to do differently, a lot of challenges to take on, and I've really enjoyed it so far.
Awesome. And before we get into the book Press Reset, I did want to talk about, because as you know, I write myself, and I'm actually in the middle of what I would consider a really big scoop, and writing about like a really big scoop about gaming. And it's something that just
It's
kind of,
exciting.
it is very exciting. I am also terrified right now, but I it kind of fell into my lap, and kind of obviously, like, I thought about how you write about these things, and I've referenced a lot of the way in which you kind of have written your scoops in the past when thinking about writing this one out. And I wanted to know what you consider your first scoop to have been, and how it kind of came about to you. What kind of led you on this path of being the press sneak fuck?
Um, my first, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this was necessarily my first, but one I remember was a story that I was happy to do after Kotaku, like my first month at Kotaku. I remember there were some layoffs at a game company, and I was able to report that like they had a game canceled that was supposed to be like an exclusive game for the next Xbox, which at the time was the Xbox One, was the big next gen
Mm,
exciting Xbox. And Yeah, I mean, there's really I can't really go into details as to how I got it. Oftentimes, it's difficult to get too specific about things like that. But I remember being very excited about it, and nowadays. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you're first starting out, or when you're first starting to get into this territory of like breaking news and doing original reporting. Um, Even the smallest things seem really exciting to you, and then
Hmm.
when you've been doing it for a while, it's more like you try to focus a little bit more on the bigger stories. So there's some stories that I might have reported on or done earlier in my career, that I don't think I would do in the same way now, which is kind of like the evolution of how a reporter works.
Interesting. God, to think, obviously you've been in the industry for a while and you've been doing this for a while, but to think that like your first scoop was around the Xbox One, which just feels so close to me. Like that doesn't feel as long ago as it is. So when you mentioned that my first scoop was around the Xbox One, I was like, well, that was only like 2 years ago. No, it wasn't that long
Yeah,
ago.
this is 2012.
Yeah.
2012 is what I'm talking about, which was, I guess,
God.
9 years ago. My career started, basically, I mean, really 2009 is when I started writing about games, in a serious way professionally.
Hmm.
I was freelancing for a couple of years after that, and I started Kotaku in 2012. I had some stuff at Wired that was scoopy, but like nothing that really sticks to mind as like something where I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that. The Kotaku one just the Xbox one just sticks
Six
out
out.
in my brain for some reason. I don't know why.
So let's talk press reset. So obviously this is a follow up to Blood, Sweat, and Pixels,
Hmm.
which in my brain, and correct me, if you think that this isn't an apt description, but whereas Blood, Sweat, and Pixels was about the games made by developers, this more focuses on the developers that make the games. But there is a lot of similarities. You are still very much talking about the development history of some of these games. How did the press reset come about? Were you like, I want to write another book? Did you know that it was going to take the form that it did at the beginning, or did you just think I'm just going to write about 10 more games? How did this book come about?
Well, I definitely, so yeah, Bloodstone and Pixels was divided into chapters. Each one told the story of how a game was made. I knew that for my next book, I didn't want to do that again. I did not want to repeat the same thing because I found that thought really boring and just did not want to do it. Even though I got some people asking me to do something like that, but I just was not interested in that. For a while, I was chasing a couple of other false leads that like led me down some paths of reporting that I eventually decided weren't the way to go. And then at some point, like 20 towards the end of 2018, after like a few months of researching and reporting on some other ideas, I decided to switch gears, and I decided, hey, I'm going to write a book about studio shutdowns. And it started because I was like really interested in stories like 38 Studios and Irrational Games, and I thought that there could be a book in like telling some of these stories and covering one of the video game industry's biggest woes, which is volatility. And I don't think it's talked about on the same level as maybe we talk about other things like crunch and misconduct and stuff like that. But volatility and the instability of the video game industry is really what's driven a lot of people out of it. And so I felt like that would be a good theme and a good topic to explore in this book. And then I figured I would do it sort of similarly to Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, in that it was more of an anthology of stories rather than just focusing on one person or one company or something like that. But I also knew that I wanted this book to feel like one big story rather than 10 independent stories. And that was very deliberate with Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. Like, I very deliberately wanted each story in that book to be completely standalone. You can open up the book to flip to your favorite game and read about that, and you don't have to read the whole thing. But for this, I wanted it to be one narrative, and maybe it would explore different companies and different game studios and games and people. But I knew I wanted it to be one story, and so yeah, so this was the result of a lot of false leads and then a lot of reporting, and yeah, eventually took this shape.
Yeah, one of the things I think people will be surprised with by the book is how interconnected the stories are. And it always
Mm-hmm.
felt like opening a new chapter, the chapters kind of, might shift focus to, sometimes it's like, oh, this kind of minor player in the previous chapter is now the focus of the next chapter. or we switch gears entirely and then we bring in players from the previous chapters back into the fold. And that was one of the things I really, I really love Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. But and I thought that, when it was more about like the volatility, you would, when you first announced press reset and we're talking about like it was about the volatility of studios. I was like, that I'm very interested in that, but like, is it going to be like, I guess like the hook of like learning about the behind the scenes of these games and how they were made? I was like, is that gonna, how much of that hook is going to be there? But the hook for me was always kind of discovering how these stories interconnected the more I read the book. And at points, I think that adds to the doom and gloom because it's a bit of a bummer at points. Well, it's a lot of a bummer at points.
Yeah, I describe it as a bleak but optimistic book.
And I would definitely agree with that. But, so it's always funny when you get to the next chapter and you read someone's name and you're like, oh no, I see where this is going already. So that being said, you wanted to do this interconnected story. You have these studios, and it does feel like a pretty amazingly woven tapestry for what is a a pretty random series of events. How difficult, what was the process of like finding the stories? Did you know, obviously you mentioned that you wanted to talk about 38 Games and Irrational. Did you know how you were going to put these stories together? Did you have to find the stories, the puzzle pieces as you went? What was the process for weaving that tapestry?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, it kind of happened by coincidence because I knew I wanted to do Irrational Games, and I knew I wanted to do a chapter about Warren Spector because I talked to him before and heard a little bit about his journey, and it was fascinating to me. And that's the first chapter of the book, and it tells a very compelling story about Warren Spector's career. And I think that coincidentally, it just happened to be that Warren Spector's work was the lineage of that is BioShock and is Irrational Games, and then it turns out that Warren Spector inspired a lot of people. So I was really fascinated by that, and but it all kind of came together like by coincidence, by happenstance. In fact, originally I wrote the Warren Spector chapter, and it was going to be somewhere else in the book, and then I was like, wait a minute, this is like the top of the tree. This is where all the branches are, I guess the root of the tree. This is where all the branches are coming from. And then Irrational led me to 2K Marin, which is the studio that made BioShock 2 and then disappeared. And then kind of the immersive sim was haunting a bunch of these studios. And then towards the latter half of the book, I would say the book is kind of divided into two halves is the way I look at it. The first half is the lineage of Warren Spector and immersive sims, and then the second half of the book is online games. And there's a lot of various stuff, and I trace back the online game in one chapter to Richard Bartle, who's the inventor of the one of the co-creators of the first Mud, which was essentially the first MMO, the first online game. And so I tried to trace that sort of lineage and see what happened with like companies that tried to make online games, and looked at them, and looked at like games as a service and a variety of other themes that played into that stuff. But none of that was all like pretty much after I decided, okay, these are the most interesting studios and these are the stories that I'd like to cover. It wasn't like I picked themes like that and then wrote to them. It's more that those themes came out kind of naturally from me saying, okay, I'm writing about 38, I'm writing about Mythic, I'm writing about big, huge games. These all kind of play into the themes. And then the third part of the book, I guess I shouldn't have split it into halves because there's a third section.
There's an epilogue.
Is about solutions to these problems. And that's why I describe it as a bleak yet optimistic book, is because I really wanted to make sure that this wasn't a book that was just like laying out all these flaws, all these big critical issues of the games industry without also exploring, hey, how do we fix these things? And so I dedicated a whole chapter of the book to exploring, again, through storytelling, different ways in which the games industry could potentially be fixed. And yeah, so hopefully I think people will walk away from this feeling like, man, some serious problems here, but they are fixable and there are ways to go about solving these issues.
Yeah, it's really funny because I knew that I would probably get the opportunity to talk to you about the book. And as I was reading it, I was like, one of the questions I got to ask Jason is, what does he think are some of the solutions? And then I came upon the last chapter and I was like, oh, it's laid out here. So obviously, you've written 2 books now about the industry. You've written a bajillion articles. I think that's statistically accurate. Was there anything about writing this book that surprised you? Was there anything in talking to someone that really was like, oh my God, like, or was it all kind of like par for the course? I mean, you've been in the trenches with so much of this for so long, and I just wondered if there was anything in this book that when writing it you were kind of shocked by.
Yeah, a bunch of stuff. It's almost hard to remember now because I did the reporting for this book 2 years ago now.
Mm.
So it's like anything that was a shock to me then just feels like I've gone over the material so much that it's all like normal to me now. But yes, definitely. Like for example, I knew the 38 Studios story. I knew kind of the bones of what happened there. Some of the details I didn't know, and got to flesh out some of that stuff in the book. But I knew essentially what happened. Like Kurt Schilling, former Red Sox pitcher, started this game studio. It all failed in glorious fashion, took all this money from the state of Rhode Island, et cetera, et cetera. What I didn't realize was that there was another company called Big Huge Games in Maryland that had an even wilder story, I would say, that was affected in its own way, and like went through all sorts of hell and back at the end of once 38 Studios, the ripple effects came all the way down to Maryland, and they were all fired too, unceremoniously let go too. And the story of what happened next, what happened at Big Huge Games after the 38 implosion, just was wild to hear about and report about, and like so sad. And that to me was really surprising. But there were a lot of like little things, a lot of cases with these stories, like the Warren Spector story, really all of it, everything in the book is all the stories in the book. I kind of had an idea of the broad outline of what had happened, but I didn't know so many of the details, and so many of the details are like what you remember and what are fascinating and what really resonate with you. So, yeah, I think people who come into this book, like even people who know the broad strokes of some of these stories, will find a lot, will get a lot out of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the 38 Studios, it's funny because like as I was reading it, I think that the everything that happened with Ken Levine and Irrational Games at the beginning feels kind of like this is where everything is kind of going to spin out from, and then that kind of transitions into everything at 38 Studios and Big Huge Games. And in that, I think, you talk about the two halves. I think that, in my opinion, is kind of where like the switching happens, and like that forms like the connective tissue between the two halves. And I totally think that, yeah, like at the core of this book, like the 38 Studios is in some ways like the most kind of like the fact that the Big Huge Games thing happened. So many people, as you pointed out, I think in a tweet a couple of weeks ago, everyone thinks 38 Studios made Reckoning. Everyone thinks that they made Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, and that was kind of like the bright spot. Is like, well, it all went down in a ball of flames, but at least they made that. And then it turns out they just basically bought that game and repackaged it as their own thing. Which, read the book to get the details on that. But that was mind blowing to me as someone who, for the last 10 years, has thought, oh yeah, 38 Studios, they had one hit.
Yes, yeah. I think people will learn a lot from this book.
Were there any stories that you wanted for the book that you either like tried to follow the thread of and it wasn't necessarily going where you wanted, or you just like couldn't get in contact with anyone about the story?
Yeah, so one of my original plans for the book was to do a chapter about Telltale Games, which shut down like as I was starting to report on the book in the fall of 2018. And I spoke to some people there, and in fact, I included some of their stories in the epilogue. But ultimately decided that the story had been actually pretty well told by some other reporters. There's some really good reporting out on the internet. Megan Faroukamesh at The Verge wrote some good stuff. My former colleague Ethan Gatch was doing some good Telltale reporting, and so I decided this is like well-trod territory at this point, so I don't really need to do a full chapter in it, but I'll just include some of these stories to kind of help reflect and illustrate what people have to go through when this sort of thing happens. So that's in there as well, but not as a full chapter.
Right. Yeah. And I remember, yeah, it touches obviously on those Telltale stories. So you've written Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. Press Reset coming out May 11th, digitally, physically, audiobookly, potentially as well. So orally, yes.
You are
Audibly. I heavily recommend everyone obviously pick it up. I was honestly, I knew I had high expectations, and I'm being sincere here. It kind of blew past them for I think the connectivity between the stories is the thing that like makes this a compelling read beyond just an interest in the gaming industry. Like I said, like I was reading it to my girlfriend, and I'd be like, and then this person showed up from chapter 3, and she was like, like audibly gasping, like, oh my god. So I think that to me was like, oh, like this is like regular folk able to enjoy this. But I assume your book writing career is not over with Press Reset. How are you feeling about a third book? And if so, can you speak at all to what that might look like? Obviously, you might not want to. You might want to change kind of paths again. Just wondering if you have any interest in talking about that at this point before your second book even comes
Come
out.
on, man. Can I launch a second book first?
I
No,
need the
yeah,
juicy
I've
sound bites. Third
well,
book confirmed. You know, like I need you to confirm it right now, Jason. Please.
so what's funny is that in the book industry, what happens is you write a book, you finish it, and it goes through various editing processes. You send it out to your friends for like early reading and feedback and stuff like that. But you're essentially finished like many months before it actually comes out. And so I was basically pencils down on this thing. I mean, all the major changes, everything major was done like last fall, so like October, November of last year. I did a couple of like copy editing stuff for the final version in February or March of this year. But other than that, like it was mostly done last year. So over the past 3 months or so, while I've been waiting this excruciating wait for the book to actually come out, I have of course been thinking about what do I want to do next. And I have this idea for a third book that has been stuck with me that I've been obsessing over, that I think I can make work, but I cannot talk about it yet because
It has to
the
become a
people.
book.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't signed anything. I want to talk to there are a lot of people I have to talk to. There's some key people that I would want to get on board as far as doing interviews with me for me to make this book happen. But yes, I had, unlike the first, after Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, I really had no idea what I was going to do next. This time, I kind of, it's funny, when I was writing this book, I was like, man, fuck this, I'm gonna go write fiction next. I can't deal with nonfiction anymore. But since then, I've come up with this idea. I've obsessed over it, and I'm very excited about the possibilities if it works out. But like this wouldn't be out if it
For a while.
happens. It wouldn't be out for another 2 3 years. So not something to even think about just yet. For now, Press Reset is in stores May 11th. I think people will really like it. And then
Absolutely.
if enough people buy it, then maybe I
Yeah,
can do
please
it.
go buy it because that's that the fact that you've got this earworm, this brainworm of an idea, and that something that came from writing Press Reset, or that was came from a different source.
No,
No. Okay.
came from elsewhere.
Um. So, um, at the end of the book, as you said, I think the last chapter, human problems, human solutions, is that the human costs, human solutions,
Hmm.
obviously speaks to, I think it's like four basically like potential solutions or parts of a solution to the gaming industry's woes. Um, I think you present them in a very obviously matter of fact way of just presenting the information of here is what in all of my research, people that I've been talking to, this is what they think the solutions potentially could be. I think I might know the answer to this one, but out of the four or out of other solutions that you've heard, which is the one that you think like could be the biggest effector of change in the gaming industry, and the one that like if anything happens, like this is the one that needs to be tackled.
Yeah, well, the problems that I presented are volatility. That's the big problem that I presented in this book. What happens? How do you sustain a career in games when your studio can shut down at any time? When you have to move around, you have to move across the country or move across the world every time you need a new gig, and you are just exhausted and you just don't want to do it anymore. The other stuff I think is other stuff I've explored like crunch and low pay and harassment and other stuff is not really the subject of the book. And I think that like in general, broadly, the solution or the way to kind of give workers a seat at the table to fight for a lot of this stuff is unionization, which is something I explore in the book. But I actually think that the problem of volatility is best solved, or really the reason that the video game industry is unsustainable, and the kind of the solving that problem is really best solved through something really simple, and that's remote work. And it's funny, I finished the bulk of the manuscript. I finished before the pandemic even started, and I was exploring the idea of like, okay, the worst thing that can happen in the video games industry is you lose your job. But what makes that really just soul crushing is that if you're at a studio in Boston or Rhode Island or something like that, and it disappears, there's no place you can go in those cities. There are very few big game companies in those cities. So if you want to stay in the industry, you might be able to find another job, but it might be 3,000 miles away. And maybe that's okay if you're in your 20s, if you're young, if you're okay with traveling. But like if you're in your 30s or older, you have a family, you have kids in school, it's just not practical to just keep uprooting your life every time this happens. So the big question to me wasn't like, how do you stop this volatility from happening? Because in some ways that's inevitable. When you're talking about games, they each cost like the biggest ones can cost tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to make, years and years of people's lives. So of course they're going to be super risky, and if they don't sell X million copies, they're not going to make a profit, and the company could go under. So that's something that like is part of this business model, and there are ways, and I explored ways to like try to solve that problem. But let's say that problem can't be solved, or let's say we can mitigate the risks there, but we have to accept the fact that like there's no way to stop a company from running out of money. Like that can always happen in capitalism. It could happen. So how do you make it more viable to keep a career? And the answer to that is let people work from wherever they want, because if Irrational Games closes and suddenly you have 100 people stuck in Boston who maybe want to get new jobs in the games industry, and they don't want to move, then they're screwed. Like a lot of people after Irrational closed, because Boston doesn't have a lot of AAA games, a lot of people just went to other industries like banking and stuff like that, technology. And so if they have the option of like, okay, I'm going to get a job at EA in San Francisco without moving to San Francisco, I'm just going to stay in Boston, it would be industry changing. It would like make the industry so much more accessible. It would make it so much more, it would prevent people from burning out in a lot of ways, because like if people didn't have to keep shipping themselves across the country every time they lost a job, or across the world every time they lost a job, suddenly it would be more viable to maintain a career in gaming.
Now, obviously, you speak to the pandemic, and that has caused issues, let's say, in its broadest sense for the industry. Do you see a kind of a silver lining in that of more places allowing for remote work? And do you see, do you think that the pandemic in a way has kind of forced that change to come about? Do you think that in a few years the industry will be better off for it? We are going to have people like working remotely, or are you getting the notion that the moment that it's possible, we're all like all of that remote work, like progress that's been made, is going to be undone once people just can go back to the studios?
I think the former, because I think the companies that are smart and embrace remote work will have such an advantage when it comes to like recruiting and getting talent, because they'll get the most talented people who like live wherever and don't feel like coming to an office, or want to come into an office 2 days a week or whatever. And so those companies will have such an advantage that like the companies that insist on 5 day a week like office work and no remote workers, et cetera, will just not be able to compete, and I think they'll just screw themselves. So yes, I'm optimistic about that, and I'm optimistic that like it's been going on for long enough, and enough people have realized that like, oh yeah, I can actually do my job remotely, that it's going to be an option in the future. I mean, that said, like remote work definitely has its cons, but it's really hard to isolate remote work as a variable in pandemic productivity, because a lot of companies' productivity has gone down, but we're also in the middle of a pandemic that is like devastating on people's lives and mental health, and maybe they had friends or family who got sick or died, and so it's impossible to say like remote work led to the lack to
Right.
lowered productivity. So yeah, I'm really interested. I'm really curious to see what the companies do. I think a lot of people have not really made decisions yet, but I expect we will see more flexibility.
Awesome. Well, I truly hope that's the case. Um, so looking forward to at the future, obviously there is never going to be a lack of stories to write about the industry. Obviously, we're in the middle of learning a ton of shit about Epic right now with the Apple and Epic stuff. Um, to you, what is there like a holy grail of stories? Is there something that is happening right now, or the beginnings of which is happening right now that you want to write about, or maybe even in the past that like that's the one that got away? That this is the story that I've been chasing and I've just never been able to get to it.
Well, I can't answer that because it's gonna be my third book. No, here's a story. One good story that I've always wanted to do, but just never did for various reasons, is I wanted to be in the room when Xbox decided when they announced the Xbox One and then decided to do the DRM reversal and change everything in 2013. So in May of 2013, they announced the Xbox One. They said it would be always online, and then there was so much backlash that like a few weeks later they were like, actually, never mind. We're doing a normal console launch. And I would love to like tell the story of like who was in the room for those conversations, like what did that look like, what were the different factions, and who was for, who was against, et cetera, et cetera. But that's something I just never did for a variety of reasons. But it's a story I would love to read one day or tell one day.
Awesome. So we have some questions from the chat before we go.
Sure.
Eric the Dragon, Eric Francisco over at Inverse. You will also be speaking to Corey Plant over at Inverse at some point. So
I spoke to him already.
oh, so you spoke to him already. I'm sorry, I forgot. Go to inverse.com, sister site to Input Mag, to also read Jason's interview if you want more questions answered that weren't answered here for Corey's interview. But Eric asks, gaming journalism has become so access-based. Have you had to sacrifice any kind of access as you pursued more dogged investigative reporting on the industry?
Oh yeah, all the time. Well, so it's interesting. I wouldn't say that it has become so access based. I would say it's always been access based. Like games journalism, the original games journalism was magazines that just printed what publishers sent them and stuff.
True.
Yeah, definitely. I've had to sacrifice a lot. I mean, it's been no secret that Bethesda has blacklisted me for like 8 years now, something like that. Other companies tend to be hot and cold. Sometimes they'll be pissed at me for a variety of reasons. People at all of the game companies. What's funny is that like sometimes they'll all accuse me of being obsessed with them or like only focusing on them, which is funny and says a lot that all of them are saying essentially the same thing. But yeah, a lot of game companies are not fans of me, and I think that's a healthy thing. I wish that there was more of that sort of thing and more adversary journalism, but I mean that's very difficult for a variety of reasons, mostly financial and systemic. But yeah, no, a lot of game companies do not want to deal with me or respond to my questions or send codes or anything like that. So yeah, it's I'm used to it.
Speaking of kind of at that adversarial journalism, obviously, a lot. It's funny as someone that's been in digital media, and I'm sure you felt the same way, especially as former people that were people that formerly worked at GMG. Reading these stories is like, oh, I see so many similarities between what's going on here and what has happened at places that I've worked at. Speaking to like digital media, and like profitability and retaining, being able to retain staff and all those things. What do you think like the future of that is? Do you think that it's moving to a subscription based model? Do you think it's yeah, I just wondered like your opinions on that, or if that's something too big to even tackle.
No, it's terrifying. I've seen all sorts of parallels between the gaming industry and the media industry, and it's like really frightening. Because unlike the games and the biggest difference between the games industry and the media industry is that the games industry actually makes money. Games industry is bringing in bazillions, $180 billion in revenue every year. The media industry is not. And that's really scary. And it's really scary that media companies seem to have such a hard time making money and bringing in revenue. It doesn't help, obviously, when like private equity firms come in and like staff management of companies with dinosaurs who are clueless and hostile and inept. But in general, I mean, I think the lack of money is a real problem in media, and I don't know how to solve that.
Okay. Fourth book.
Yeah, one day, sure.
Let's end on a light note here. Steve in the chat says, "I'm a sucker for indie games like Turnip Boy that I didn't plan on purchasing but were crazy fun. What's your favorite game that seemingly came out of nowhere to suck you in?"
Tons. All the time, games come out of nowhere and suck me in.
Yeah.
Outer Wilds from last year or 2 years ago stands out to me as a game that really came out of nowhere and just blew my mind. But yeah, no, it happens all the time. Return of the Obra Dinn was another one that came out of nowhere for me. Baba Is You mentioned before. Yeah, a lot of really good ones in recent years.
What's the game this year that you're most looking forward to play that's on the horizon?
Looking forward to, I don't really know. I mean, I guess we're waiting and seeing what Nintendo does, because I'm kind of working under the assumption that they're gonna announce the Switch Pro and have like Breath of the Wild 2 alongside that.
Do you think that's a 2021 thing?
I do. I even though everything is delayed, obviously because of COVID, I've been hammering that drum for a while about how all the COVID delays are going to happen this year, because last year people were able to get things out because they were in final stages of production, but like COVID really slowed down 2021 games. But I don't know. I guess I'm a little optimistic that Nintendo has been working on this game for a while and could do it. But then again, it's a Zelda game, so it's probably going to get delayed multiple times. So who knows? But yeah, I don't know. I feel like we don't have a good idea of what is actually coming this year. So it's hard for me to say what I'm excited for. Like, who knows what's actually going to make it out this year?
If you had one game that like
Breath of the Wild 2.
Yeah, Breath of the Wild 2. Okay,
my one
cool.
game. Oh yeah.
Now, before we go, I've got a little off-topic question. This one's from Dusidney in the chat. He says, in Looper, the film, the criminal organization kidnapped Joseph Gordon-Levitt's friend to lure in his future self. By torturing his present self, his future self is also affected. Does this make sense?
What? I haven't seen Looper.
Oh no!
What?
Oh, you okay? Well, you go watch Looper, and then we'll interview you about Looper. That'll be the next chat we have. We'll be all about the movie Looper. Sure. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Sure. I would give the details, but you do the honors. When is Press Reset coming out? How can people buy it? What should they do to
May
promote
11th.
it? Mm-hmm.
May 11th, people can buy it anywhere. Go buy it and read it, and hopefully it strikes a chord with you, and yeah, enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, so much for tuning in. If you've come in late or anything, there will be a VOD of this going up at youtube.com/unranked podcast, so you can catch the full interview after that. Like I said, also, Jason has done an interview with Corey Plant over at inverse.com. Please also go read that. And also, Jason will be doing interviews at a bunch of other places, and I'm sure
that's true,
answering a bunch of questions that we didn't get to today. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll speak to you next time. Have a good day.